My mom watched from the window, while I crawled in the snow on all fours with a collar that said, bitch. When I begged her to let me be human again, she just whispered, it's just until you learn respect. I stayed silent. That was nearly a year ago. This morning, she testified against him with her hands shaking and her voice breaking on every word. My stepfather demanded I live as the family dog. I needed to crawl on all fours and be confined to a doghouse to keep me humble and safe from my own sexuality. Dan moved in when I was 11, bringing rules that made my skin crawl. He measured my shirts daily, banned me from talking to boys, and made me sit on the floor during dinner because good girls stayed low. Mom said he was just protective after only raising sons before me. She'd been so lonely since dad died that she ignored the way Dan watched me, how he commented on my changing body with disgust. When I got my first period at 12, he acted like I'd committed a crime. He said I was becoming dangerous, that puberty turned innocent girls into temptresses who destroyed families. When I was 13, Dan found me trying on mom's lip gloss. His face went dark. You think you're a woman now? He dragged me to the backyard and pointed at the shed. Pack your things. You're moving out there. When mom protested weakly, he explained his solution. I'd live as the family dog until I learned humility. No walking upright, no human speech, no eating at tables. He'd train the sexuality out of me by making me remember I was an animal, not a woman. He bought a collar with my name on it and bowls labeled Betch. I had to crawl everywhere, bark for attention, and sleep on a cushion in the shed. If I tried to stand or speak, he'd spray me with the hose in winter or lock me outside in summer heat. Mom watched from windows, wringing her hands but never intervening. It's just until you learn respect, she whispered when Dan wasn't around. Please don't make this harder. Living as Dan's dog was the most humiliating thing imaginable. Every morning, I'd crawl to the back door and scratch to be let out for bathroom breaks in designated corners of the yard. Dan installed cameras to ensure I never stood up, even when alone. He'd make me fetch things in my mouth, roll over for guests, and beg for scraps of food. When his friends visited, he'd laugh about his method for keeping teenage girls pure. Obviously, he couldn't send me to school in the state, but he had a solution for that too. Dan told the state I had severe anxiety and needed homeschooling. Instead, he gave me dog training manuals to study. I spent hours practicing being a good girl to earn basic necessities. Sit for water, stay for food, heel for a blanket when temperatures dropped. He documented my training in videos, saying other fathers needed to see how effective this was. The hardest part was mom's compliance. She'd pet my head while crying, saying things like, you're such a good girl, this will be over soon. But she'd also fill my dog bowls and call me for walkies, playing along with Dan's delusion. When relatives asked about me, she'd say I was going through a phase and preferred the outdoors, making it sound like being a dog was my choice. I developed sores on my knees and palms that got infected. When I tried showing mom, she just bought me knee pads. Every day I felt my humanity disappear more and more. I was becoming the animal they saw me as. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I turned 15, and Dan decided to breed me. He brought home a 17-year-old boy from his church, explaining that good dogs needed puppies and I was the right age for a litter. The boy looked horrified as Dan explained how he'd mate us in the shed while supervising to ensure proper behavior. Don't worry, Dan told him. She's well trained. She won't bite. He got out of there as fast as he could, and I broke one of Dan's cardinal rules as soon as the door shut. I spoke out loud like a human being and said, I'm not a dog. They were the first words I'd spoken in 2 years, and my voice came out rusty and broken. Dan raised his hand to hit me, but I kept talking. I'm a human being. I'm your stepdaughter. This is insane. Mom started sobbing, and for a moment I thought she'd finally help me. Instead, she grabbed the spray bottle. Bad dog, she said. You know the rules. I stood up on legs that barely remembered how, towering over her despite my atrophied muscles, but Dan charged at me with my leash and collar, screaming about teaching me a permanent lesson. I ran, my legs buckling, toward the neighbor's house where I'd seen children playing. Maybe someone would believe me when I told them I'd been forced to live as an animal. The neighbors called the police, but Dan was ready. He showed officers 2 years of therapeutic documentation, proving I had severe psychological issues. He'd fabricated an entire history. Therapist notes about my clinical lycanthropy, prescriptions for antipsychotics I'd refused to take, testimony from church members about my violent delusions. He even had mom's tearful statement about how I insisted on living as a dog despite their efforts to help me. She bites, Dan told the officers calmly, attacks other children. We had to keep her separated for everyone's safety. He showed them the shed set up like a bedroom, not a kennel, with edited footage making it look like I chose to crawl. Mom nodded along, saying I threatened to kill myself if forced to act human. The officers believed every word. They approached me with restraints while Dan signed commitment papers. 72-hour psychiatric hold, the male officer said, for her own safety. I tried to run, but my legs, weak from crawling, buckled. As they carried me to the police car, Dan leaned in close. The facility I chose has a special ward, he whispered, for girls who need permanent behavioral modification. They'll make the dog training look like paradise. Mom wouldn't meet my eyes as the car door slammed shut. Through the window, I saw Dan mouth the words, bad dog. The police car smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. My wrists ached where the restraints dug in, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the panic clawing at my chest. The psychiatric facility Dan had chosen loomed ahead through the windshield, a gray building surrounded by high fences. The female officer glanced back at me through the mesh divider. Something flickered in her eyes when she saw my raw knees through the torn fabric, the sores on my palms visible even with my hands cuffed. She opened her mouth and closed it again and looked away. At intake, a tired-looking nurse named Theodore took my vitals while Dan filled out paperwork. He spoke in his church voice, the one that made him sound reasonable and concerned. Every lie he told made my stomach twist tighter. Mom stood behind him, clutching her purse like a shield. Theodore frowned at my blood pressure reading and took it again. Then he examined my knees, his expression growing darker with each infected sore he documented. When he lifted my hair to check behind my ears, he found the collar marks on my neck. Dan noticed the examination and stepped forward. Those are self-inflicted. She insists on wearing dog collars. We've tried everything to stop her. Theodore made notes without responding. He asked me to open my mouth, checking my teeth and throat. My voice box felt swollen and damaged from 2 years of enforced silence. When he pressed gently on my throat, I winced. Has she been receiving regular medical care? Theodore asked, still examining me. Of course, Dan said smoothly, though she often refuses treatment. Her delusions make her violent with doctors. Theodore's pen paused over his clipboard. He looked at my medical records, then back at me. The dates didn't match up. According to Dan's fabricated history, I'd been seeing specialists regularly, but my body told a different story. A security guard led me to a small evaluation room while my parents waited outside. Dr. Frederick, the psychiatrist on duty, was younger than I expected. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and didn't immediately start writing when I sat down. I'd like to hear your version of events, he said simply. My throat burned as I tried to form words. 2 years of barking and whimpering had damaged more than just my voice. The words came out scratchy and broken, but I forced them out anyway. I told him everything. The collar, the shed, the cameras, the boy Dan brought to breed me with. Dr. Frederick listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked to see my knees again. He photographed the sores, the calluses on my palms, the muscle atrophy in my legs. He documented everything meticulously. I'll need to verify some details, he said carefully. Would you consent to a full physical examination? I nodded, hope flickering for the first time in years. The examination revealed more than infected sores. X-rays showed stress fractures in my wrists from bearing weight on all fours. My spine had compression damage. My knees had chronic bursitis. Blood work indicated severe nutritional deficiencies consistent with eating scraps rather than balanced meals. While I waited for results, Theodore brought me real clothes. Not the rags I'd worn, but soft sweatpants and a proper shirt. He helped me dress when my damaged hands struggled with buttons. The doctor wants to keep you for observation, he said gently, at least until we can verify some information. Through the observation window, I watched Dan arguing with with Dr. Frederick. His calm facade cracked as the doctor showed him my test results. Mom had shrunk into herself, no longer meeting anyone's eyes. That night, they placed me in a regular room, not the behavioral modification ward Dan had threatened. The bed felt strange after years on a cushion. I kept starting awake, expecting to hear Dan's whistle calling me for punishment. The next morning, Dr. Frederick returned with a social worker named Josephine. She specialized in abuse cases and had already started investigating Dan's claims. The church members he'd listed as witnesses told conflicting stories. Some hadn't seen me in years. Others described Dan's training methods in ways that made Josephine's expression harden. We've also reviewed the videos your stepfather provided, she said. Our tech specialist noticed they've been heavily edited. The timestamps don't match up. Well, Dan's brilliant therapeutic documentation really backfired when actual medical professionals took one look at those knee injuries and went, wait a minute, dogs don't usually need x-rays for stress fractures. Dan arrived for visiting hours, but they wouldn't let him see me alone. Through the safety glass, I watched him try to maintain control. He brought Mom as his ally, but she looked different, smaller. Her hands shook as she signed the visitor log. She needs her specialized treatment, Dan insisted to anyone who would listen. This place doesn't understand her condition. But the evidence mounted. Theodore had found old medical records from before Dan moved in. Normal checkups, normal development. No signs of the psychological issues Dan claimed I'd always had. The paper trail he'd created only went back 2 years, coinciding with when he'd forced me into the shed. Josephine interviewed me again, this time with a camera recording. My voice grew stronger with each session, though it still cracked and rasped. She showed me photos of the shed that police had taken after getting a warrant, the cameras, the dog bowls, the collar still hanging on its hook. No one's going to make you go back there, she promised. But Dan wasn't giving up. He hired a lawyer, claiming the hospital was violating his parental rights. He brought character witnesses from his church. He accused the staff of coaching me to lie. On my 4th day, something shifted. Mom came alone during visiting hours. The staff debated allowing her in, but I nodded my consent. I needed to face her. She sat across from me in the visiting room, tears already streaming. For the first time in years, she looked directly at me. Really looked, not at the animal Dan had tried to make me, but at her daughter. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. The words hung between us. Part of me wanted to rage at her, to demand explanations for every time she'd filled those dog bowls, every time she'd held the spray bottle, but I stayed silent, letting her fill the space with her guilt. He made it sound so reasonable at first, she continued. Just structure, discipline. He said teenage girls needed firm boundaries, and I was so scared of losing him, of being alone again after your father died. Her excuses made my stomach turn, but I let her talk. Every word she spoke was being recorded, every admission of what she'd allowed. When he put you in the shed, I told myself it was temporary, just until you learned to respect him. But then days became weeks, and weeks became months, and I couldn't figure out how to stop it without admitting what I'd let happen. You sprayed me with water, I said, my voice still hoarse. You called me a bad dog. She flinched as if I'd hit her. He said if I didn't support him, he'd have you institutionalized permanently. He said he had connections, ways to make sure you never came home. I thought playing along would keep you safer than fighting him. The social worker knocked, signaling time was up. Mom stood to leave, then paused. The videos, she said quietly. He has more than what he showed the police. Hidden drives. I know where they are. After she left, I told Josephine about the hidden drives. The investigation expanded. Dan's carefully constructed story began unraveling faster. The psychiatric facility refused his demands to transfer me to his chosen behavioral modification ward. They classified me as a vulnerable patient requiring protection, but I knew Dan wouldn't stop. He'd spent 2 years training me like an animal, documenting his abuse as therapy. He had too much invested in his delusion to give up now. Even from the safety of the hospital, I could feel his influence trying to reach me. Dr. Frederick increased my therapy sessions. Slowly, I relearned how to be human, how to walk without crawling first, how to eat with utensils instead of my mouth, how to speak without fearing punishment. My body began healing, though the damage would take months to fully repair. 2 weeks into my stay, Josephine brought news. They'd found the hidden drives Mom had mentioned. The unedited videos showed everything. Dan forcing me to crawl, him spraying me with freezing water in winter, me begging in human words to be let inside, only to be punished for speaking. It's enough, she said. More than enough. But Dan had one more card to play. He'd been spreading stories in the community about the psychiatric facility brainwashing me. He organized protests outside, claiming they were destroying a loving family. He painted himself as a persecuted Christian father, trying to save his troubled daughter. Some people believed him. They held signs demanding my return to my loving home. They shared edited clips of the videos online, making it look like I was a danger to myself and others. Dan stood among them, playing the grieving stepfather perfectly. Inside the facility, I watched the protests on the news. My stomach churned seeing him perform for the cameras, knowing what he was capable of when no one was watching. The other patients avoided me, unsure what to believe, but Theodore and the medical staff stood firm. They'd seen my injuries. They'd documented my trauma. They knew the truth, even if Dan's supporters refused to accept it. As my 72-hour hold extended into weeks, I focused on getting stronger. Physical therapy helped my legs remember how to support my full weight. Speech therapy repaired my damaged voice. Each small victory felt monumental after 2 years of being forced to be less than human. The legal battle loomed ahead. Dan's lawyer filed motion after motion, trying to force my release into his custody. Mom wavered between supporting me and fearing Dan's retribution. The community remained divided, but I had something Dan hadn't counted on. I had survived. Despite everything he'd done to break me, to turn me into an animal, I'd held on to my humanity. And now, with each passing day in safety, I grew stronger. The real fight was just beginning. The psychiatric facility became my battlefield. Each morning brought new challenges as Dan maneuvered to regain control. He arrived during every visiting hour, sometimes with church members who vouched for his character, other times with documentation he'd forged overnight. The staff grew weary of his persistence, but protocol required them to hear him out. Physical therapy sessions revealed the extent of my body's damage. My therapist, a woman named Sandra, documented how my hip joints had developed abnormally from years of crawling. She worked with me daily, teaching my muscles to support upright posture again. The sessions left me exhausted and sore, but each step forward felt like reclaiming a piece of myself Dan had stolen. During one session, Sandra noticed fresh bruising on my ankles. The marks puzzled her until she realized they matched the restraint patterns from my years in chains. My body had developed pressure sores that reopened with minimal contact. She photographed everything, adding to my medical file that grew thicker each day. Dan's protests outside intensified. He recruited more church members, painting himself as a father denied access to his mentally ill daughter. They prayed loudly, sang hymns, and held vigils. Some protesters brought their own troubled teenagers, claiming they wanted Dan's successful methods for their children. The facility had to hire additional security. Inside, other patients began sharing their stories with me. A girl named Rebecca had escaped her stepfather's basement after 3 years. Another patient, Marcus, had survived his mother's attempts to keep him dependent through systematic poisoning. We formed an unofficial support group, recognizing the similar patterns in our abusers' behaviors. Dr. Frederick arranged for specialists to examine my case. A forensic psychologist reviewed Dan's documentation and immediately spotted inconsistencies. The handwriting analysis showed Dan had forged multiple signatures. The dates on his fabricated therapy notes didn't align with known facts. Some of the therapists he claimed I'd seen didn't exist. Mom visited again, this time bringing a small suitcase. Inside were clothes that actually fit me, not the rags I'd worn for years. She'd also hidden something else beneath the folded shirts. My old diary from before Dan moved in. The entries showed a normal 11-year-old girl, excited about school, friends, and typical preteen concerns. No signs of the mental illness Dan claimed I'd always had. She revealed more about Dan's past during that visit. His first wife had left him under mysterious circumstances, taking their sons and disappearing. Mom had found old court documents suggesting custody custody disputes and restraining orders, though Dan had explained them away as his ex-wife's mental instability. The parallels made her physically ill as she recognized the pattern. Theodore discovered something crucial while reviewing my blood work. The nutritional deficiencies showed specific patterns consistent with an extremely restricted diet, not the balanced meals Dan claimed he'd provided. My vitamin D levels suggested almost no sun exposure for extended periods. My muscle mass was that of someone who'd been bedridden, not actively choosing to crawl. The facility's security footage became evidence too. Cameras had captured Dan's visits, including moments when he thought no one was watching. His mask would slip, revealing flashes of rage when staff denied his demands. He'd been caught trying to slip something into a gift basket for me, which security confiscated and found to contain sedatives. Josephine worked tirelessly building a case. She interviewed neighbors who'd wondered why they never saw me anymore. Teachers from my old school confirmed I'd been a normal student before vanishing from classes. Even some church members began questioning Dan's stories when presented with evidence. One church elder, Mr. Patterson, came forward with disturbing information. He'd noticed Dan's obsession with controlling young women in the congregation. Several families had quietly left the church after Dan offered to counsel their teenage daughters. Dan's protest group outside sounds like the world's worst fan club, holding prayer circles for a guy who kept his stepdaughter in a shed. The elder had kept records of complaints that were never formally filed. My voice grew stronger through speech therapy. The therapist explained how prolonged silence and animal sounds had damaged my vocal cords. She taught me exercises to rebuild proper speech patterns. Each clearly spoken sentence felt like defiance against everything Dan had tried to erase. During a group therapy session, I practiced telling my story to other patients. Their reactions validated what I'd experienced. No one questioned whether it was real. They recognized the calculated cruelty, the systematic dehumanization. Their acceptance helped me trust my own memories. Dan escalated his tactics. He filed complaints with the state licensing board, claiming the facility was experimenting on me. He contacted journalists, trying to spin a story about psychiatric abuse. He even attempted to have Dr. Frederick's license reviewed. Each attack required the staff to spend precious time defending their treatment instead of helping patients. The hidden drives Mom had mentioned proved difficult to locate. Dan had moved them after her visit, suspicious of her loyalty, but technology worked against him. The facility's IT specialist found traces of the videos Dan had uploaded to cloud storage, thinking they were safely hidden. The unedited footage was far worse than what he'd shown police. One video showed him forcing me to eat from the dog bowl while his friends laughed. Another captured him hosing me down in freezing weather as punishment for looking too human. The worst ones documented his training sessions, where he'd hurt me until I responded only to whistles and commands. No reasonable person could watch them and believe I'd chosen that life. Mom's transformation accelerated as evidence mounted. The woman who'd enabled abuse for years began fighting back. She searched the house while Dan was at protests, finding more documentation he'd hidden. Bank records showed he'd been transferring money to accounts she didn't know existed. Phone records revealed calls to facilities specializing in troubled teen modification. She brought everything to Josephine, finally choosing her daughter over her husband. The guilt ate at her, visible in her hollow eyes and shaking hands, but she pushed through it, providing passwords to Dan's computers and locations of hidden cameras he'd installed throughout the house. Dr. Frederick consulted with colleagues about my case. The consensus was clear. I showed classic signs of severe abuse, not mental illness. My behaviors in the facility were consistent with someone recovering from trauma, not someone with the conditions Dan claimed. The medical evidence was overwhelming. Physical recovery remained challenging. My body had adapted to crawling in ways that made walking painful. Bone density scans showed early osteoporosis from malnutrition. My teeth had damage from eating without utensils. Each medical discovery added to the mounting evidence against Dan. The facility implemented new security measures as Dan's protest grew aggressive. Some protesters tried to block ambulances. Others attempted to storm the building during shift changes. Police had to maintain a presence, though Dan was careful to keep his own actions just within legal bounds. I learned about grooming techniques in therapy, recognizing how Dan had slowly normalized the abnormal. The progression from measuring shirts to living in a shed hadn't happened overnight. He'd pushed boundaries incrementally, always framing it as protection or discipline. Understanding his methods helped me process the shame I'd carried. Rebecca, my fellow patient, shared her escape story in detail. She'd kept evidence hidden in plastic bags buried in her yard. When she finally ran, she'd gone straight to a teacher who'd always been kind to her. That teacher had believed her immediately and refused to let her stepfather take her home. Her story gave me hope that Dan's control could be broken. The facility arranged for me to continue my education. A tutor assessed my knowledge gaps from 2 years without schooling. Despite everything, I retained more than expected. Learning became a form of rebellion, proving Dan wrong about my worth and capabilities. Mom revealed Dan had been planning to move us to a different state. He'd been researching places with less stringent homeschooling oversight. He'd even contacted a commune that promoted traditional discipline for wayward children. The plan had been to disappear with me before I turned 18 and could legally escape. Security cameras caught Dan trying to recruit one of the facility's janitors. He offered money for information about my treatment and schedule. The janitor reported him immediately, but it showed Dan's desperation was growing. He was making mistakes he wouldn't have made when he felt in control. My physical appearance changed dramatically with proper nutrition and medical care. The sores healed, leaving scars that would fade with time. My hair grew back where stress had caused it to fall out. I gained healthy weight. Each improvement was documented, contrasting sharply with photos from my admission. Dr. Frederick warned that Dan might attempt more drastic measures. Abusers often escalated when losing control. The facility increased security around my room and restricted my outdoor privileges to protected areas. The precautions felt like another form of captivity, but I understood their necessity. Josephine discovered Dan had a history we hadn't known about. Before Mom, he lived in 3 different states, always leaving abruptly. Each move coincided with investigations that never quite reached conclusion. He was expert at staying just ahead of consequences, but that expertise was failing him now. Mom found my old belongings Dan had boxed up in the attic. Photos of me with friends, report cards showing good grades, awards from school activities, evidence of the normal life I'd lived before he decided I was dangerous. She brought them to me, and seeing my past self helped me remember who I'd been. The other patients became my support network. We created our own language for discussing trauma, understanding without judgment. Marcus taught me meditation techniques for managing panic attacks. Rebecca showed me how to document everything in ways abusers couldn't destroy. We were survivors teaching each other how to survive. Dan's church began fracturing. Some members remained loyal, but others started questioning. A few families came forward with their own concerns about Dan's behavior. The youth pastor admitted he'd been uncomfortable with Dan's fixation on teenage girls' purity. The divide weakened Dan's support base. Physical therapy milestones came slowly but steadily. The day I walked the entire hallway without stopping, Sandra cried. When I managed stairs without holding the railing, it felt like conquering a mountain. My body was remembering how to be human, despite everything Dan had done to break it. Theodore noticed something during routine rounds. I'd started standing straighter, making eye contact, taking up space. The submissive postures Dan had trained into me were fading. He documented these behavioral changes as evidence of recovery when Dan claimed the facility was making me worse. Mom admitted she'd been recording Dan secretly for weeks before I'd escaped. She had audio of him describing his training methods to friends, bragging about his control. She had footage of him doctoring evidence for the police. Her phone contained proof of his lies, gathered by the woman who'd enabled him for so long. The facility's lawyer prepared for Dan's inevitable legal challenges. They compiled medical records, security footage, witness statements, and expert opinions. The case file grew to multiple boxes. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. I was an abuse survivor, not a mental patient. Dr. Frederick arranged for independent psychiatric evaluations. 3 different specialists examined me, reviewed the evidence, and reached identical conclusions. I showed no signs of the disorders Dan claimed. Instead, Instead, I displayed textbook symptoms of complex trauma from prolonged abuse. Dan's mistakes multiplied as pressure mounted. He contradicted himself in statements to different agencies. He accused staff members who then provided evidence against him. His carefully constructed narrative was collapsing, and his panic made him reckless. I started writing again, documenting my experiences in my own words. The process was painful but necessary. Every page reclaimed my voice from the silence Dan had forced on me. Josephine said my written account would be powerful evidence, showing the coherent thoughts of someone Dan claimed was delusional. The facility became my sanctuary, but I knew it was temporary. Plans began forming for my eventual discharge. Where would I go? How would I live? The questions terrified me, but facing them meant believing in a future Dan had tried to steal. Mom filed for divorce, finally breaking the last chain binding her to Dan. He responded with rage, but legal protections were now in place. She moved in with her sister temporarily, beginning her own journey of recovery from his manipulation. As weeks passed, my body grew stronger, my voice clearer, my resolve firmer. Dan's protests dwindled as supporters saw through his lies. The truth was emerging despite his desperate attempts to bury it, but I knew he wouldn't give up easily. Men like Dan never did. The real confrontation was still coming. The morning everything changed started like any other at the facility. I was in physical therapy with Sandra when Theodore rushed in, his face pale. He whispered something to Sandra, who immediately helped me to a chair. Through the window, I saw Dan's truck in the parking lot, but no protesters. Just him, sitting alone, staring at the building. Dr. Frederick appeared moments later with 2 security guards. Dan sitting alone in his truck like some sad villain in a low-budget movie is almost pitiful. From cult leader with protesters to lonely guy in a parking lot watching his whole scheme fall apart. He explained that Dan had been caught on camera the previous night attempting to break into the facility through a service entrance. The attempt failed, but what worried them more was what police found in his truck: rope, sedatives, and detailed maps of the building's layout. The facility went into immediate lockdown. All patients were moved to secure areas while police searched the grounds. I sat in a windowless room with Rebecca and Marcus, listening to footsteps rushing past. Rebecca held my hand as we waited, understanding the terror of an abuser getting too close. Hours passed before Josephine arrived with updates. Dan had been taken in for questioning, but released on bail within hours. His lawyer argued the break-in attempt was simply a desperate father trying to see his daughter. The items in his truck were explained away as camping supplies and prescription medication. Without concrete evidence of intent to harm, they couldn't hold him. Mom showed up that afternoon, hysterical. She'd found Dan's journal while packing to leave him permanently. The entries detailed his plans to remove me from the facility by any means necessary. He'd written about taking me to a remote property owned by a church member where he could continue my training without interference. The final entry, dated that morning, simply read, "Today, I reclaim what's mine." Dr. Frederick made immediate arrangements to transfer me to a more secure wing. As orderlies wheeled my bed through corridors, I caught glimpses of Dan's supporters gathering outside again. But something had shifted. Their numbers were smaller, their chants less confident. News of his break-in attempt had spread through the community. That evening, Mr. Patterson visited with 3 other church elders. They'd been conducting their own investigation after multiple families raised concerns. What they'd discovered went beyond my situation. Dan had been counseling troubled girls from the congregation for years, always insisting on private sessions. Several families had moved away suddenly after their daughters spent time with him. The elders had brought documents, complaints that were filed but mysteriously disappeared, testimony from former church members, even photographs of Dan's previous home showing similar modifications to what he'd done to our shed. They decided to formally revoke his membership and ban him from church property. Sandra worked with me on emergency mobility exercises, preparing for the possibility of quick evacuation. My legs were stronger now, but still unreliable under stress. She taught me techniques for moving efficiently despite my limitations, focusing on practical escape routes rather than perfect form. Security footage from that night revealed more disturbing details. Dan hadn't been alone during his break-in attempt. 2 men from his protest group had served as lookouts while he tried to access the building. When questioned, they claimed they thought they were helping him retrieve personal belongings I'd supposedly stolen. Mom's divorce lawyer arrived with crucial information. During asset discovery, they'd found Dan had been building a legal case for years before I escaped. He'd been corresponding with lawyers specializing in parental alienation cases, preparing to paint any escape attempt as evidence of mental illness. The paper trail showed methodical planning dating back to when I first entered the shed. The facility increased security measures dramatically. Off-duty police officers were hired for round-the-clock protection. All visitors underwent enhanced screening. My outdoor privileges were suspended indefinitely. The other patients understood without explanation. They'd lived through similar escalations with their own abusers. Josephine discovered Dan had been visiting other psychiatric facilities in neighboring counties, trying to find one that would accept his transfer request. He'd presented himself as a concerned father dealing with a violent daughter, shopping for a facility that would be more sympathetic to his perspective. Most had turned him away after reviewing his documentation. Physical evidence continued mounting. The IT specialist recovered deleted files from Dan's computer showing hours of additional footage. Unlike the edited versions he'd shown police, these videos included audio of him giving commands, threatening punishments, and discussing his training methods with other men who visited to observe his success. Mom brought more items from the house. Medical supplies Dan had stockpiled, including veterinary-grade sedatives and restraints marketed for large animals. She'd found receipts showing he'd been purchasing these items for months before I escaped, suggesting long-term plans for escalating control methods. The church community began fracturing more dramatically. Families who'd supported Dan started questioning their involvement as more details emerged. Some admitted they'd been uncomfortable with his methods, but assumed he knew best as the head of household. Others revealed they'd only participated in protests because Dan had implied their own daughters might need similar intervention someday. Dr. Frederick arranged for me to give a formal statement to investigators. With Josephine present, I detailed everything I could remember about the 2 years in the shed. The investigators were particularly interested in the other men who'd visited to observe Dan's methods. My descriptions helped them identify several individuals who'd expressed interest in implementing similar training with their own families. Mom's mental state deteriorated as the reality of her complicity sank in. She began intensive therapy, finally confronting how she'd chosen Dan over protecting me. Her therapist contacted Dr. Frederick about coordinating treatment, recognizing that our traumas were intertwined in complex ways. The facility's educational coordinator accelerated my learning program. Despite the security concerns, they recognized I needed to prepare for eventual independence. I threw myself into studies, making up for lost years with fierce determination. Each completed assignment felt like reclaiming another piece of my stolen adolescence. Dan's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He was spotted parked outside Mom's sister's house where she was staying. He left rambling voicemails on the facility's public line, alternating between threats and pleas. His remaining supporters distanced themselves as his mask of reasonable concern completely dissolved. One morning, Theodore brought unexpected news. Dan had been arrested again, this time for attempting to hire someone to retrieve me from the facility. He'd approached an undercover officer at a truck stop, offering $5,000 to help him rescue his daughter from kidnappers. The conversation was recorded, including his detailed plans for taking me across state lines. This time, bail was denied. The judge reviewed the accumulated evidence: the break-in attempt, the stockpiled supplies, the hiring attempt, and the documented history of abuse. Dan was remanded to custody pending trial for attempted kidnapping and conspiracy charges. The change in the facility was immediate. Tension everyone had been carrying suddenly released. Security measures remained in place, but the constant vigilance relaxed slightly. I slept through the night for the first time since Dan had discovered my location. Mom testified before a grand jury about Dan's actions. Her statement, combined with the video evidence and witness testimonies, resulted in additional charges. The prosecutor built a case that went beyond my situation Escalation, examining Dan's pattern of targeting vulnerable young women throughout his life. My recovery accelerated without the constant threat of Dan's interference. Physical therapy progressed to jogging short distances. Speech therapy expanded to include public speaking exercises, preparing me to testify if needed. The educational program caught me up to grade level in most subjects. Other survivors at the facility celebrated with me. We understood the significance of an abuser finally facing consequences. Rebecca shared how her stepfather had been sentenced to 12 years. Marcus's mother was serving time for poisoning charges. These victories felt rare and precious in our world of systematic abuse. The church formally apologized to our family and others Dan had targeted. They implemented new policies requiring background checks and multiple adults present during any counseling sessions. Several families who'd left because of Dan returned to the congregation. Mom and I began supervised joint therapy sessions. The work was painful, addressing her failures and my anger. Progress came slowly, but the therapist helped us navigate the complex dynamics of survival and complicity. I wasn't ready to forgive, but I was willing to understand. As Dan's trial approached, I focused on building a future. The facility connected me with transitional programs for abuse survivors. I researched educational opportunities, part-time jobs, and independent living arrangements. Each plan represented hope that Dan had tried to extinguish. The trial itself was anticlimactic. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Dan's lawyer negotiated a plea deal. He was sentenced to 15 years for attempted kidnapping, conspiracy, and child abuse. The judge ordered no contact with me, directly or through third parties, for life. I watched the sentencing via video link from the facility. When the judge read the verdict, I felt something shift inside me. Not celebration or relief, but a quiet recognition that I'd survived. Dan had tried to erase my humanity, but I'd endured and exposed him. 3 months later, I left the facility for a transitional living program. My legs were strong enough to run if needed. My voice was clear enough to speak my truth. The scars remained, physical and emotional, but they no longer defined me. Mom and I maintained limited contact as we both continued therapy. She lived with permanent guilt for her choices. I lived with permanent consequences of those choices. But we were both learning to live as ourselves, not as Dan's creations. The last time I saw Dan was in a courtroom. He looked smaller in his orange jumpsuit, stripped of the power he'd wielded over me. When our eyes met, I didn't look away. I stared back at the man who'd tried to turn me into an animal, letting him see the human being who'd survived his worst efforts. I testified clearly about everything he'd done. When his lawyer tried to paint me as delusional, I calmly recited facts, dates, and evidence. My voice never wavered as I described the shed, the collar, the dog bowls. The jury saw the truth Dan had desperately tried to hide. After the verdict, I walked out of the courthouse on legs that had once been forced to crawl. I spoke to reporters in a voice that had been silenced for years. I existed as the person Dan had tried to erase. That was my victory. Simply being human despite everything he'd done to strip that away. The transitional program provided structure while I rebuilt my life. I earned my GED, started community college, and found part-time work. Each normal moment felt revolutionary after years of being treated as less than human. I was learning to trust my own choices again. Some nights I still woke up expecting to hear Dan's whistle. Sometimes I caught myself checking corners for cameras. Recovery wasn't linear or complete, but each day I chose to stand, speak, and live as myself was another step away from the shed and toward a future I was creating. Alright folks, that's my cue to log off. Appreciate you letting me tag along and throw in a few laughs along the way. Subscribe for more content like this. See you in the next one.